The Battle of Kamatero was an armed conflict during the Greek Revolution between the Greek forces under the command of the Greek ex-officer of the French army, Colonel Denis Bourbaki, and the Ottoman forces led by Reşid Mehmed Pasha. The battle ended with the decisive victory of the Ottomans on the night of the 27th of January 1827 in Kamatero, Greece. Before the battle, in late 1826, the retired colonel of the French army Constantin Denis Bourbaki, after getting permission from the Greek government in Naples, formed a force battalion of 800 men, using his own money but also an amount that was offered by Philhellenic clubs of Europe. During the last days of 1826, the battalion landed in Loutraki to strengthen Georgios Karaikakis' army. But after government orders they moved to Eleusina to help Vassos Mavrovouniatis. A few days later, Panagiotakis Nataras arrived there as well, with a force of 1,200 men. From Eleusina, Vaovachis and the two other chieftains, with united forces, moved to Manidi, where on the 22nd of January prevailed in battle against the Ottomans. On the 26th of January, the combined force of approximately 3,500 men camped in Kamatero. The battle helped to distract Reşid Pasha's forces from engaging the armies of British General Thomas Gordon while they were completing their defensive fortifications on the hill of Munichia. On the 27th of January 1827, 2,000 Ottoman foot soldiers and 600 horsemen, covered by artillery, attacked under the command of Kutai Pasha against the Greeks, who had split their forces in two. Vaovachis had lined his men on the field, while Mavrovouniatis and Nataras held positions at the foot of the adjacent mountain, a third of a mile far. More specifically, the artillery of Kutai Pasha attacked Mavrovouniatis and Nataras, while at the same time the infantry and cavalry of the Ottomans attacked the forces of Vaovachis on the field, who formed the vanguard. Despite the resistance of Vaovachis and his men, they were defeated, especially because of the Ottoman cavalry. The forces of Mavrovouniatis and Nataras were defeated as well and were forced to a disorderly retreat, most of them fleeing to Salamis Island, while the Ottomans chased them. Results and evaluation. The battle ended in a crushing defeat of the Greek forces. From the rebels' side, 300 to 350 fighters were killed, including two French Philhellene officers, the surgeon of the army and Dionysios Vaovachis, the head of whom was cut off and sent by Kutai Pasha as loot to the Sultan Mahmud II. Trikoupis blames Vaovachis, while Macrianis believes that Mavrovouniatis is responsible, arguing that placing the troops in such a weak position was his initiative. Moreover, he expresses his doubts about the fighting abilities of the men that Vaovachis had enlisted. Bibliography. Finley, George. History of the Greek Revolution. W. Blackwood and Sons, 1861. Kautsonikas, Lambros. Gamma epsilon mu iota kappa eta iota sigma tau omicron rho iota alpha tau eta sigma epsilon lambda lambda eta nu iota kappa eta sigma epsilon pi alpha nu alpha sigma tau alpha sigma epsilon omega sigma. Volume 2. Alpha theta eta nu alpha epsilon upsilon alpha gamma gamma epsilon lambda iota mu omicron sigma delta kappa alpha rho alpha kappa alpha tau zeta alpha nu eta sigma. 323 to 327. Kremos, Georgios. Cairo omicron nu omicron lambda omicron gamma iota alpha tau eta sigma epsilon lambda lambda eta nu iota kappa eta sigma tau omicron rho iota alpha sigma. pi rho omicron sigma k rho eta sigma iota nu pi alpha nu tau omicron sigma phi iota lambda omicron mu alpha theta omicron upsilon sigma iota delta alpha delta epsilon tau omega nu epsilon nu tau omicron iota sigma gamma upsilon mu nu alpha sigma iota omicron iota sigma mu alpha theta eta tau omega nu alpha theta eta nu alpha delta eta mu eta tau rho iota omicron sigma iota alpha sigma epsilon mu iota delta eta sigma. 28. Trichoepis, spiridon, iota sigma tau omicron rho iota alpha tau eta sigma epsilon lambda eta nu iota kappa eta sigma epsilon pi alpha nu alpha sigma tau alpha sigma epsilon omega sigma epsilon kappa delta omicron sigma iota sigma tau rho iota tau eta epsilon pi iota theta epsilon omega rho eta theta epsilon iota sigma alpha kappa alpha iota delta iota omicron rho theta omega theta epsilon iota sigma alpha upsilon pi alpha upsilon tau omicron upsilon sigma upsilon gamma rho alpha phi epsilon omega sigma epsilon kappa tau omicron upsilon tau upsilon pi omicron gamma rho alpha phi epsilon iota omicron upsilon tau eta sigma omega rho alpha sigma epsilon nu alpha theta eta nu alpha iota sigma. 1888. Vaculopolis, apostolis, iota sigma tau omicron rho iota alpha tau omicron upsilon nu epsilon omicron epsilon lambda eta nu iota sigma mu omicron upsilon. Volume 7. Theta epsilon sigma alpha lambda omicron nu iota kappa eta. 1986.